Please work. We're live. Hello, highlighters, and welcome to today's episode of Highlights. You guys, today I am so pumped because we have one of the top 50 business thinkers in the world, recognized as the #1 communication coach. She's a consultant, a keynote speaker. She's taught at Duke. She's taught at Columbia. She's written Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Stand Out, which was named the #1 leadership book of 2015 by Inc. magazine. This gal is a former presidential campaign spokeswoman and was described by the New York Times as an expert at self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. Talk dirty, I'm here for it. A frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review, she consults and speaks for clients including Google, Microsoft, and the World Bank. Dorie Clark, welcome to Highlights, my friend.
My goodness, thank you so much. Great to meet you, Erin, and great to be here.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you here. I have heard so much about you from our friend Petra Kolber and our mutual friends in Speak and Spill. And I spent all day yesterday watching your TEDx talk and reading your book. And just, I looked at your Wikipedia page as well, I have to admit. You left high school when you were 14 years old. Is this true?
I did, yes.
Oh
not
my gosh.
not to hit the streets. I went to college, just to clarify.
And then you got your Master of Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School.
I did, yes.
Fantastic. So obviously someone with your pedigree, I mean, having worked as the press secretary for the former U.S. Labor Secretary, having been a journalist, having worked in all these incredible capacities, I think the #1 question that's first and foremost on all of our minds is, which was better in your opinion? Finding Dorie or Finding Nemo?
That's an important question for sure. I will actually tell you that I tried to watch Finding Nemo and I found it so upsetting because the first, like I'm really bad with like children's movies because like people are always dying. And so like the first thing that happens in Finding Nemo is like, rah, 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 your parents are dead. And I was just like, I can't do it. I can't, no, I'm out. And so I stopped it. And yeah, so the answer is I've never seen either. I found them too traumatizing.
Fair enough. Well, just for the record, you and the Dorie from the two most famous Dories that I think the world pretty much knows is Dorie Clark and Dorie from Nemo. So you share the stage with her. So it's a good movie. Check it out sometime. Fast forward through the beginning. It gets better, I promise.
I appreciate that. I think we also have some thick competition with Dorie Greenspan, who's a well-known baker. I keep hoping that somehow we can have a Dorie summit and maybe she'll bake me something. So, we'll just put that out into the universe.
I love it. Well, Dorie, your book was so great, Entrepreneurial You, and it started with this incredible story where you are flying business class from Asia, you're drinking a mimosa, you're in the lay flat bed, you just worked your butt off for 2 weeks, you made 35 grand, you are like up at 30,000 feet, living your best life, thinking, I have made it. But then something happened that made you reconsider what making it might actually look like. Can you tell us more?
I can. I had, it was a fantastic trip and it was, I had all these exciting accoutrements like, the business class travel and I had been teaching in a foreign country. But it was not easy. I had a cold while I was there and I had to teach for 6 hours a day with this terrible cold and I still couldn't kick it when I came back. And, so I worked to earn this money and I came back and I was emailing with my friend John. And John, meanwhile, had been doing email marketing during that same period of time. And he had earned basically more than I had from sending 6 emails. And I was like, excuse me, what is wrong with the universe? And how can I get in on this immediately?
Wow. So that was kind of the moment where you're like, I am trading time for money. And I want to figure out how I can not be working my ass off, but still be making a difference and making it happen. So is this kind of what inspired this book for you?
It was one of the pieces. Yeah. I had been thinking a lot. And actually it turned out that kind of unexpectedly, this had benefits during COVID, although unanticipated ones. But since 2014, I had really been thinking a lot about the world of like online courses and online marketing. And the reason that I was so interested in it, I mean, first of all, there's the scale that you can reach a lot more people, but also just in kind of wargaming possibilities. I had been spending a lot of my time and earning a lot of my money from things like giving keynote speeches at conferences or for corporations, or doing executive education, business school teaching. It was all stuff that demanded that I fly around the world. It was very labor intensive. It took my time and physical labor. And I thought, okay, number one, if there is a recession, this is probably the first thing they're going to cut. So there's a risk there. Number two, if I got sick for some reason, I mean, God forbid, some illness or something like that, and I couldn't do it, I would be in a sort of damaging position where I wasn't able to earn money. So I thought, okay, online courses are a great hedge against both of those things. So I started learning about and experimenting with them starting 6 years ago. It turns out, fortunately, that online courses also happen to be really good in a pandemic, although I was not anticipating a pandemic. But it turned out to be helpful that I had done that planning in advance, and in fact had, let's see, it's here somewhere. It all led to the creation, as you mentioned, Aaron, of writing this book, Entrepreneurial You, which is kind of my journey in figuring out how to create multiple streams of income in your business.
Well, and it's just so relevant now more than ever. I mean, I was looking at the Wall Street Journal this morning, and I think I was showing you this before we hopped on the old school analog paper here. And there's an article, front page, talking about all these inspiring stories of Americans that are becoming their own bosses. I mean, they're setting up small businesses to adapt to this new reality. This I call it the weird now, not the new normal, but the weird now. And people are, we've been pushed to come up with these new ideas and new products and new services. And so your book, even though it wasn't written this year, it sure is more relevant than ever. And I thought what was cool was, you opened the book by saying it's the dirty secret of today's entrepreneurial economy. Being excellent and even being well-known and respected in your field just isn't enough. So that was kind of a strong open. So when there are different people listening right now that are experts in their field, that have had their lives kind of figured out, they kind of had their rhythm going, maybe some fellow keynote speakers that had, life pretty locked down pre-pandemic. What do you say to people that right now are kind of looking at this new reality, this weird now, and asking themselves, I know I'm ready to reinvent. I know that I have what it takes. I know I have something to offer the world, but I'm just not really sure where to start. What would you say is a good first step for them?
Well, one of the things that I've actually been doing during COVID myself, which it was always something I was familiar with. It was always something that I thought like, well, that's a good idea. But I didn't actually personally do it for my own business until now, is actually doing scenario planning, where you write out actual different potential scenarios, multiple ones, right? So, there's the terrible outcome and the great outcome and, the sort of weird outcome. Like you want to create a number of them. Like I did, I think 5. And what the part that I thought was really interesting, it is not about previously, I think I thought of it this way. It's not about predicting the exact future, right? It's not like, oh, I called that. I totally knew it. We don't know anything. There's like things we can't control. It's not about getting it right. What it is about is understanding the range of possibilities. And specifically, it's about thinking through, okay, what actions could I take in each of these scenarios that would enable me to protect against downside risk and maximize my upside? And you can walk through it for each of these possibilities. And undoubtedly, there are going to be certain things that you can do that for multiple scenarios are still a good idea. And so if you come up with 5 scenarios, and there is something that you could be doing that in 3 of them would be really helpful, that is what you should be doing. That's the thing that can, we can't always get it right, but statistically, you can stack the deck that if in, let's say, 60% of the possible outcomes, you've already planned for something, it's a pretty darn good idea.
Yeah, I love that. The problem for me is I have so many ideas. And if you're an entrepreneur listening, and I'm a 3-time entrepreneur, I mean, I started Jump Digital Media, I started PMS.com, I had social agency for the last 10 years. And now as a keynote speaker and an author, it's like 4.0. So I haven't had a boss technically besides myself, which is a crazy boss, for 10 years and 15 years now. And it's one of those things where I feel like I stacked so many different decks that like even this year when the pandemic hit and all of my speaking business went away, like all of us, and we lost all of our money and all of our bookings. And people were like, don't you want to do virtual? That's like 900 times more work for 1/5 of the money. And you're like, what is happening? So when all this happened, I had all these scenarios and I launched this podcast. I launched a new email. I wrote a new book. I created a new course. I did all the decks and all the stacks and all the scenarios. And I found myself now at the end of 2020, and I feel like I'm kind of half-assing 6 or 7 ventures and none of them are really like taking off. So how do we, if we have stack overload, if we have too much entrepreneurial energy, how do we figure out how to prioritize, maybe like to your point, the 1, 2, maybe 3 scenarios or directions we should chase?
Yeah, you point to something important, Erin, which is that I think it's important to consider every possible scenario, but not necessarily enact every possible scenario.
I should have talked to you a couple months ago. Keep going. Yeah.
Yes. So, ultimately it's true. It becomes impossible over time to do everything well, right? So the question that I always like to ask myself is, what's the first domino? What is the thing that is the cornerstone that if I can do this well, it will help all of the downstream things. So I'll give you an example from my own thinking. So as we were actually talking about just before this, I have a new book that's going to be coming out next September from Harvard Business Review Press. And so obviously thank you. So a lot of my thinking at this point is like, okay, so much of 2021 is going to be about promoting this book. We know that that's going to be kind of a central focus. As you know, because you have a book coming out in June, there's a lot of ways people can promote books, right? There's like a million options. You could kind of get overloaded and overwhelmed with it. And so you need to pick something that actually can be a cornerstone. You could, I could say, well, I'll launch a podcast, or I'll do this, or I'll do that. What I actually think is probably going to be my scenario, and this is something I also did for my previous books, Reinventing You and Stand Out. I'm planning to do it even more for this book, is to be on a really, really aggressive podcast strategy. And part of the reason that that's actually valuable, I mean, of course, right, podcasts are a good way to reach people, but something that I've discovered, which is interesting, is that being on podcasts not only is a good way to promote the book and sell the book, connecting with podcast hosts actually has turned into an interesting sort of business development strategy for me in some ways, because a lot of the people who host podcasts themselves are actually the kinds of folks that are looking to build their brand. They're looking to, sort of grow their impact. And oftentimes people that I've met first in that context end up becoming coaching clients. They end up joining my recognized expert course and community and things like that. And so on multiple levels, it's actually a great way for me to connect with people who might themselves want it, or certainly could be referral sources for people that actually turn into not just publicity, but also literal business for me.
Yeah, no, it's so smart. And so if someone's listening and they're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not even there yet, because so there's crawl, walk, run. I feel like this is more of like a run, right? We're sprinting. We've already kind of worked all these years on building our thought leadership platforms and our following in our communities. What if someone's listening and they're like, either I have a job that I'm not super stoked on, or I have a venture or a side hustle that I've always been talking about doing, but 2021 is going to be the year that I'm going to make the jump. I think for those people that are sort of in the crawl phase and they're trying to figure out, how do I even get to a place where I can create an awesome, podcast strategy on the circuit and meet cool people and drive business by talking about my ideas, which is a dream for a lot of people. I think that part of what you talked about in your book was you talk about the reality that if you do want to accelerate from a crawl to a walk or a run, and if you are trying to figure out how to make a move, there is a reality that I certainly know firsthand of having to take that step back and having to take the step back to make the big leap forward. So, like, for example, for me, when I was running a social agency for 10 years, making tons of money, working with some of the world's biggest brands, I felt the most trapped. I felt the most unhappy. I felt the most chained to my desk. I feel like I wanted to call out sick, like, to myself and just lie and say I couldn't go to work to myself, because you just felt like, I'm like, why am I even doing this? And so, when my speaking business kind of started to create itself, we had a client in Vegas and the speaker canceled. And so I filled in, and that's how the whole thing started. It's totally random. But when I realized how much and I loved it, I was like, okay, if I keep having a foot in each world, I'm never going to be able to do this. And so I took a major pay cut. I fired a ton of my staff. I got rid of a bunch of clients. I had 2 or 3 just to kind of keep the lights on, but I cut my salary in half for like 3 years, and I'm just starting to get back to where I was. So it's like there's that reality of like you have to take this huge hit usually in order to like create the space to be able to move forward. So can you talk a little bit more to that, and if someone's afraid to do that, how you might be able to elevate that mindset to feel brave enough to take that step?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, the first is you're absolutely right. There's a reason that not everybody is successful. And that is that some people are willing to make the necessary sacrifices and some people are not. And in order to kind of break through and get to the next level, one of the things that I've seen a lot with, coaches and consultants who I work with really frequently, there is a problem that many people encounter, which is once they sort of build up a successful enough business where, great, they had referrals coming in and, they're kind of known in their community or they're known in their field. Okay, fantastic. So they built a nice business and they're working really hard. And so therefore they're like, well, I don't have time to market myself. And it sort of turns into this hamster wheel. And the problem is that for many people, often because of obligations that they've locked themselves into, like maybe having a mortgage that's a little more than they can afford or something like that, they feel like they can never afford to not do that, to be on all cylinders and make as much money as they possibly can.
Yeah.
And so it leads to a kind of short-term mentality, because the thing that always is the best decision under those circumstances is to do the client work and to make money in the here and now. The thing you never do is the important but not urgent, which is creating content or doing long-term marketing initiatives that actually might mean that you can raise your rates, that actually might mean that you bring in new clients that you don't have to work that hard for. It might mean you bring in, better, like higher level clients, but you're not doing that because you're just like, oh, blah, 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 I've got to get the money now and vacuum it up. And so I think that is a challenge that a lot of people face.
Well, it really is. And that's why I love how you've broken down your book, because you talk about kind of the pros and cons of growth is a big key in your book. And the way you have it broken down is part 1 is build your brand. Part 2 is monetize expertise. And part 3 is extend your reach and impact online. And I think that for whether you're trying to figure out, okay, am I ready to maybe scale back my lifestyle? Am I ready to reconsider what my priorities really are? Am I ready to, actually make a change and make a jump because we have this unbelievable opportunity where the world has been forced to slow down and we've been forced to be alone with our thoughts, and we've been forced to really look at our lives and stop next and be here now. I think a lot of people listening are asking themselves, okay, so if I do want to build a brand and I do feel like I have an idea I want to share with the world, is it too crowded? Is it too late for me? Like, is everyone, does the world need another podcast? Was a question I asked myself launching this. And so, I mean, what would you say to people that are feeling like their space is saturated, or everyone with a microphone and a social media account now has their own show? Like, is it too late for someone to jump into this space and start playing?
Well, I mean, we all know it was too late for Facebook because there was already Friendster. So,
Touche.
yeah, I mean, it always seems super crowded until, in retrospect, and then it's like, oh, well, of course, that's what the world was waiting for. And so I think actually one of the things in Entrepreneurial You
Great book.
that I this really sort of stayed with me the most, and which I end up referencing a lot because I think it's really quite powerful, is I discovered in the course of researching it a study that was done by a guy named Josh Morgan, and it was about podcasts. Specifically, it was about the longevity of podcasts. And he did a survey from 2005 to 2015. So it was a 10-year longitudinal survey of podcasts. And what he discovered, and I have to believe that in the time since, the trends have only accelerated because so many more people have started podcasts. But over this 10-year period, which is a pretty good chunk of time, he discovered that the average podcast lasted only 12 episodes before its creator just gave up and shut it down. And so he looked at the list of, like, theoretically, like, total podcasts in existence as of 2015. And only 40% of them were actually active. The rest had all gone dormant. And so when we hear these, stories about, oh, but there's hundreds of thousands, there's millions, blah, 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 blah. Well, that, yes, it's true that many have been started, but it certainly doesn't mean that there are that many. The race looks a lot different at the starting line as it does at the finish line. And so you can assume, literally just say to yourself, you know what, if I can last for 12 episodes, I have already outlasted the vast majority of other people. There's a huge value to persistence. And it's not to say that your podcast is going to become the most famous ever, but literally just by dint of you keeping at it, you are going over time to become one of the most successful. And I think the same thing applies whether you're blogging or making videos or whatever it is you're doing.
It's such a great point. And I think one thing you're also touching on is audience and figuring out really who are your people, which is what you asked me before we got live here. You said, Erin, who are your people? Who's your audience? Who's your target? Who's listening? And I explained that I have two very different audiences. And that's like the worst answer, right? Because we want to go deep and narrow. We don't want to be everything to everyone because then we're nothing
it's
to
not
no
the worst
one.
answer. The worst answer is everyone.
Everyone. Yeah. And so if people are listening, how can they figure out how to dive deep and find that niche, however you say that word? How can they find, like creating a podcast for cat owners who chew on furniture only during, Skype calls or whatever? Like, how do they drill down on that niche to kind of carve out that small group of extremists that are so into this particular topic that they're so engaged and they're so diehard? Maybe they're only 100, but they are 100 fully engaged people that are sharing, that are brand advocates, that are loyalists, that are just super fans versus the 1,000 or 10,000 that kind of dabble here and there. How do we start to figure out, who we're for?
Yeah, it's an important question, Erin. I would say, one of the easiest ways, which is what animates a lot of people, is, the sort of scratch your own itch philosophy, which is, okay, I'm basically making it for people like me. And I know that people like me have this need because I have this need. And all the people I know have this need. So, that's kind of just a good, easy, common way to figure it out is, what would you want to see in the world that doesn't exist already? But, it's not always a one-to-one. Sometimes through trial and error and through experimentation, you'll learn who your audience is. And it may not be actually who you expect. I've had a lot of conversations with my friend Mike McAllowitz, who you might potentially know. And we've talked about this question. And he said that when he was first starting, he's the author of a number of books, Profit First, Clockwork, The Pumpkin Plan. And he said when he was first starting his speaking business and writing, he was, this is years ago, so he was a young guy, and he's like, oh, well, I guess I'm, writing for people like me, like young guys who are entrepreneurs. And that was his mindset. And what he realized was like, no, actually, that's not who was paying attention. That's actually not who was coming to his events. That wasn't quite right. And so he realized, because, eventually you sort of see it with your own eyes in terms of, well, who's registering and who's emailing you back and who's subscribing to your list, that actually it was older women who were more drawn to his message. And he's like, well, I don't really know why, but like, yeah, God bless, let's do it. And so he began, really embracing that and realizing it, but it was kind of like his audience chose him.
That's so interesting. So how did you discover your audience? Because you have such an interesting background. You've worked in journalism, you've worked in academia, you've worked in politics. You really have so many different prongs of influence and networks. How did you hone in on who your people are?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it did take me a while, right? Because I think we put so much pressure on ourselves sometimes, like, oh, I launched my business yesterday and I have to know who my audience is and I have to know who my ideal client is. And of course, it's not helped because like all the people around you are asking that question, like, so Erin, who do you serve? Who's your ideal audience? And people used to ask me that, and I was just like, it was so stressful. And it felt like, oh my God, how do I even answer that? I don't really know. Yeah. And then it was embarrassing. But over time, you kind of discover the people who seem to be responding to things most. And so for me, something that proved really helpful was I have always been a big believer in the power of content creation and sharing your ideas. My preferred format for that, I don't have my own podcast, but my preferred format for that is typically writing. And so I began writing a lot for places like Harvard Business Review. I wrote for Forbes for a number of years, et cetera. And so I would get notes from readers. I would get people who were sort of coming to me, and I began to realize more and more like, oh, okay, this is sort of speaking to a particular group. And where it really got clear for me, actually, sort of remarkably, because now I'm sort of exposed to people every day. I'm interacting every day. Is we were talking earlier about online courses. So in 2016, I launched a course. I actually talk about the process in Entrepreneurial You, and it's called Recognized Expert. And I really began to see, like, so now at this point, 500 people have been through the course. They're part of, this ongoing online community. So every day I'm in there, like, hearing what people's concerns are, what their questions are. And I didn't really initially have a very clear sense of exactly who my audience was. Now I do. Now I like live it and breathe it. And the way that I would describe it is that these are people, sometimes it's very easy, like demographically, like people might say, well, I'm a coach for engineers or whatever. Mine, it's more a little psychographic. Basically, the people that I work with, they are people that you might even call them overeducated, right? Like they have a graduate degree. They might even have multiple ones. They've got like all the letters, after their name. They are so smart. They're so good at what they've done. Oftentimes what they've always believed is that whenever there's a problem, the answer is more education. And what they've come to realize is that when it comes to building a successful business and that actually makes money, and or when it comes to having the kind of brand and impact and reach that you want, education actually isn't always the answer. You need to learn something else in order to actually have your ideas be heard. And they come to me, and they come to the Recognized Expert course to figure that out, because that's the mysterious piece that you're not going to find out with another master's degree.
Yeah, and it's such a targeted, like, that's my husband. You're describing my husband to the ground. I mean, he has books, and I mean, we have bookcases and bookcases of every book on how to do anything A to Z. When in doubt, he buys the online course. He's an education junkie, but it's almost like a paralysis. Whereas I'm the opposite. I'm like, just jump out of the plane, build the parachute. I've splattered on the ground a million times, but it's like I'm more of a doer than a reader. But we've kind of over the years started to balance each other out a little bit more, where he's like, maybe like read like a little bit of the directions, and I'm like, maybe just try one thing. So we've kind of helped each other find more of a common ground. But I think what's interesting about this conversation is, if you're listening and you do feel that sort of anxiety that Dorie is describing when it comes to like, who are your people, the reason it is such a tough question is because when you find the answer, it's such a powerful, profitable indicator. It's such a cornerstone of making your strategy such a work smarter, not harder strategy. I mean, when we had Socialite, we were working in social media. I've been in social media since 2004, since the very beginning. We started with the early days. It was basically a LinkedIn type platform for trade shows and conferences. Eventually, LinkedIn wiped us out. Okay, but so since the beginning, I've been in this business of how to connect people. So social media 10 years ago was already completely saturated. Everyone with a Facebook account was a social media expert. And so we found that it was really, really hard to grow the agency because there was so much competition. And so I'll never forget looking at all the different types of social media and figuring out, okay, well, what do we have experience in? Well, we were really good at throwing live events. We were really great at creating these experiences offline that we amplified online. So we became the only social media firm for live events specifically. So if like a brand would come to us, we'd give it to somebody else. If an individual came to us, we would refer it. We literally said no to anything that was not an actual conference or trade show. What happened was we went from scrappy to, like, within 6 months, we had the Oscars, we had Fashion Week, we had all these huge associations, we had all these huge trade shows, Apex, 170,000 gearheads. We became like the go-to and we quadrupled our business. We grew like crazy because we decided who we were for. And it sounds so like classic 101 startup advice, but it's so hard to say no to anything outside of who your people are. But if you have the discipline, man, it's so powerful.
Totally. It's such a great example. I love that.
Yeah. So, okay, let's talk about the monetization, because I think a lot of people listening might be thinking, okay, well, Dorie, I mean, look, you're Harvard Business Review, you're Forbes, you've worked on all these incredible things. Of course, we want to pay to rent Dorie's brain because it's so brilliant. But what if people feel like, will someone pay for my ideas? Will they pay for my expertise? What if I don't have the MBA and all the letters after my name and all the Ivy League experience? Like, what if I have something that's a little bit more anecdotal or a little bit more roll your sleeves up? Can I still get paid to be a thought leader, to share my ideas? What would you say to those types of listeners?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say that many people, I think, erroneously have the belief that their credentials and their background is a kind of fixed thing. It's like, well, that's who I am, and that's how I have to stay. And the truth is, that is actually not the case. Because when I started my business in 2006, the most recent job that I had had prior to starting my business was I was the executive director of a bicycle advocacy nonprofit. I had literally never worked in the corporate world. I did not have an MBA. I did not have a PhD. I still don't. And I was a philosophy major and I had a religion degree, so I didn't really have any of the traditional credentials. And so over time, I have amassed them, but I amassed them through a very concerted strategy to do it. And so I think it's easy sometimes. People sometimes tend to make some excuses. It's like, oh, but they have this or they have that. Well, you know what? You can get it too. And so I had never taught, business school or anything like that. How did I start teaching business school, which is now a key part of my credentials? Well, I started reaching out to all of my friends who had connections at business schools, asking them for introductions. I mean, I made it a project for like, months and months and months. I was literally like cold calling business school departments to see about guest lecturing, to see about teaching, all these kinds of things. So I worked at it because I specifically knew I wanted that credential. When I started writing for high profile publications, it had been a very concerted strategy for multiple years to break into these publications. And I literally approached dozens in order to break in and start getting published. So if you're coming from a place where you do not have traditional business credentials, the answer is you can get it. You just have to be focused.
Mm-hmm. And hustle your ass off is what you're saying too, because you've knocked on doors. I mean, there was probably some rejection involved with some of these conversations. I mean, it sounds like you were impervious to no because you had your eyes set on the prize. You were so clear on the direction you were going. And that's a big part of the story that we don't talk about. I think with the entrepreneurial journey, the sexiness of, the hustle and grind on Instagram and the, what is it, like hustle until you no longer have to introduce yourself and, all these super like bro-tastic social media memes, but there is a lot of truth to some of them. I mean, it's kind of like, how bad do you want it? And what's your why? Like, is it to be your own boss? Is it to, be like your friend that was doing the email campaigns and making just as much money without having taught on their feet being sick for 2 weeks straight? Like, what is your ultimate reason for doing this? And so do you think that a big reason that some entrepreneurial ventures fail before they get off the ground is because they're not clear on kind of like why they're doing it in the first place?
I think that's a big piece of it. And I also think that people are too willing to accept other people's judgment of them. I think that, the truth is, like, on one hand, we know it, and on the other hand, we don't. If you look around at the people around you or the people sort of in your space, a lot of them are actually idiots. Like, I mean, you've probably, like, for most people watching this, you've probably read something, right? Some book, an article, and you're like, how did that get published? Like, I could do better than that. And the answer is, well, yes, of course you could. We don't denigrate that person. We say, well, mazel, that's wonderful. I'm glad you hustled your way into it. That's great. But what it means and what it should imply is that, of course, you can do it too. Of course you can. And so I think that, we sometimes with the first no, it's like, oh, I guess I'm not good enough. Oh, I guess they thought it wasn't that good. Well, that's not saying that some person has the right to render a judgment on you, even if they're an editor or whatever. That doesn't mean that they, have better discernment. They could have had an off day. They might have been just too busy, like, oh, no, I can't deal with any more contributors. It could be just, whatever, that maybe they don't have good judgment. Who knows? But I got rejected by so many places. And I just remember, for me, mostly I just tapped into righteous indignation, because at this point, I had been, not for long, but because I got laid off, but I had been a professional journalist. And here I was writing, and I'm like, hey, business publications, I will write for you for free. Would you like that? Would you like me to write you things for free, since I used to get paid for this? And these like ridiculous people, they were, mostly they weren't even like, no, they just didn't even bother to respond. And I'm just like, really, people? And so I was like, okay, I, in no way, shape, or form did I think that they somehow knew better than I did. I was like, okay, I'm just going to keep at it, and I'm going to steamroll these people, and I'm going to make them live to regret it.
Well, it worked. It certainly worked. Righteous indignation. That's so good. So, but you also touched on something which I think is a little controversial in the launch stage of new ventures, which is the freemium, or the freenoters, as our friends Tamsin and Tom Webster talk about in their podcast, The Freenoter. In the speaking industry, there's a lot of advice about speaking for free to get exposure, to get gigs. And whether you're speaking or you're writing or you're blogging or you're podcasting or whatever you're in, there is an element of that ramp up where either it's free or a discounted compensation. So what kinds of strategies have you found most successful when people are trying to figure out sort of the free launch? And then how do you like evolve that into what can actually pay the bills? Because we always say in our business, exposure does not pay the bills. So what is that? What's a good strategy to figure out, like, okay, now I know I'm at a point where I need to start assigning a monetary value to all this effort and all this hustle?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. I mean, the first one is, does anybody get paid for it? Because there are some things that nobody gets paid for. Oh, like Harvard's just invited you to guest lecture at their business school. Like, you're not going to be like, well, how much are you going to pay me? Like, everybody speaks for free at Harvard. That's how it works. Everybody speaks for free at TED. It's not, they're not like slipping Bill Gates 50 grand and you get nothing. Like, nobody gets paid. So if that's the case, then there's nothing wrong with it. Obviously, people are making a decision that it is a worthwhile enough, sort of laurel that you would want to do it for free anyway. I think that the distinction comes in where perhaps some people are getting paid and some people are not getting paid for it. And if that's the case, then you just have to really evaluate what the power differential is. Because if you're at a place where it's like, you know what, I have a lot more to gain by saying that I wrote for this place or I spoke at this place than they have by telling other people that I spoke there, then you know what? It's actually a fair trade, because you are getting paid. You're just getting paid in being able to borrow their social proof. So what your mission should be is to raise your profile and your status enough through doing these types of things that eventually, whatever that entity is going to feel so lucky to be able to say, oh, I got Aaron King to come speak for me, that they will be glad to give you money so that they can, in fact, say that.
Yeah, it's so good, Dorie. It's so good. So if someone's listening and they're all fired up from hearing all this incredible advice and they're like, okay, you know what? This was the sign that I needed. Today's the day. I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I don't care if Thanksgiving's next week. I don't care if it's the holiday season. I don't care if it's COVID. If stuff's going back on lockdown, I don't care. Dorie Clark has lit my fire and I am ready to make moves. What would you say would be like the first mental step or like affirmation or thing that they should either ask themselves or tell themselves to actually move from like yay to actually doing something about it?
Well, awesome. Well, I'll give you two. One is just to mention, in case it's helpful for people who are thinking about how entrepreneurship and how do you develop side income streams or a side hustle. So I actually do have a free resource, which is my 88 question Entrepreneurial You self-assessment. Folks can get it at dorieclark.com/entrepreneur, and that can actually help you think through it. So that might be step number one. But I'd say step number two is really sort of figuring out what your one clear action is. Oftentimes we try to do way too many things. I would say if you're starting from zero, like if you're not doing anything now besides like a day job, and you're like, well, I'd like to cultivate a side hustle of some kind. I am actually, speaking of freemium, I am a big fan of starting to do things for free. I have no problem with that whatsoever. The problem is when you keep doing them for free. But early on, I mean, yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, who wants to pay somebody that doesn't have any clue what they're doing? Like, no one. But if you want to learn how to do something in a sort of professional context, you find a few people, you say, hey, Aaron, I'm starting my fashion consulting business and I'm looking for a few beta tester clients. I'd love to come to your house and reorganize your wardrobe for free on Saturday afternoon. All you need to do is give me a testimonial if you liked it. Would you do that? And hopefully, if Erin trusts me at least a little bit, she'll say yes. And then you're able to kind of get the process rolling. You've got your testimonial. You're able to now tell stories to other future clients. They're like, well, how does this process work? And then you can say, well, let me tell you about one client I worked with, Erin, and here's what we did for her. And you actually sound much more authoritative.
100%. And I want everyone listening, I know they're going to go out today or Friday or first thing Monday, and you're going to try this. And I want you to respond and email and message Dorie and I on Instagram or Facebook or any of the socials. Let us know your story. Let us know your first step, because we are here and we are cheering you on, because you have what it takes. And now you have great strategies from a brilliant thinker like Dorie to execute on them. So, Dorie, thank you so much. Before we let you go, I know you're an avid reader, obviously. Are you reading any great nonfiction books that you are just like, this would be a great book for us to pick up and check out these days, besides your own, obviously?
Yeah, thank you. What I'm actually reading right now is it's an interesting book, which I always like a good book about sort of criminals and con men and whatever, because I like to sort of understand like, okay, what do I need to be on the lookout for and that kind of stuff. So I'm reading a book now by a guy named Kevin Dutton. It's called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. And it's about like
a light beach read.
Exactly. It's about like how do you sort of spot psychopaths? How are they different? What are they good at? What are they bad at? I mean, I guess they're sort of bad when they kill, obviously, but not every psychopath kills. So it's interesting to sort of learn about that, because it's kind of like a little bit like kind of crime, a little bit like con men, and a little bit neurobiology. So it's an interesting read.
Okay, I'm going to pick it up, but those types of books freak me out, because sometimes when you're reading inside the mind of a killer or inside the mind of someone who's totally insane, and then if anything sounds remotely familiar, like you've had a similar thought, that freaks me out. And I'm like, okay, closing the book.
And that's how we discovered that Aaron was actually a psychopath.
And it's right here live on the internet, people. So, oh my gosh, Dorie, thank you so much for sharing all your brilliance and your wisdom and your energy and your stories and your great advice. All the highlighters listening and myself, just really grateful for you and thankful for your brilliant brain. Everyone, check out Dorie Clark at dorieclark.com and pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial You to get this new venture party started. Dorie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. Great to talk with you.
See you soon. Take care. Thanks, guys.